Today on CityCast Denver, what if Denver didn't build a single new gas station ever again? Some members of City Council are working on a proposal that could ban construction of this car-centric business in some areas of the city, but the implications are more surprising than you might expect. An urban planner takes us behind the scenes of what a future without gas stations could look like in Denver, and the one strip of evidence that got these council members talking in the first place. Today is Thursday, September 12th. I'm Bree Davies, and here's what Denver's talking about. Naomi Grunditz-Lacewell, welcome to CityCast Denver.
Thanks. I'm so happy to be here.
So we're going to talk about this specific corridor that seems to be at the root of this gas stations issue. It's this section of Evans that runs from about Colorado Boulevard east almost to Quebec. It's a lot of parking space, car-centric businesses. Naomi, do you know this area?
Yes, definitely. I've driven down it. I've visited businesses on it.
How would you describe it as a planner? Like, what do you see when you see this corridor?
It's a prime example of an auto-oriented corridor. So when you look at those uses along it, you see buildings set back really far. You see access where parking is in the front. And there is really a pace to the corridor that is set to a car, not to a pedestrian. And that's what a lot of these corridors look like that we're talking today. But you can really sense that you wouldn't want to walk down that corridor. You would want to drive it. It's meant to be convenient to cars.
That's interesting, the pace of it. That's a really helpful way to think about it, is like it's not safe for pedestrians, really. And that's because the pace is at a car's pace,
Exactly.
Yep. It is kind of like, it's like, I there's no other word to describe it, but I think of these kinds of streets. I actually lived very close to this corridor my whole life growing up, but also like a Federal or a Colorado Boulevard. They can feel highway-ish.
Yes, and many of them are actually state highways.
That's true. So that's a good. They're like actually overseen by the highway department, and they
Correct.
are formerly, like I think Sheridan's like 88 or something. Like if you look on a map, you'll see it's a highway. Well, from a planning perspective, we're talking about also when you say so car-centric businesses, gas stations. What is the role a gas station plays in the urban design of a city? Like, how do planners view gas stations?
In many ways, they are an essential service. They're an essential part of the fabric and infrastructure of a city. We live in a time still when people really depend on their individual automobiles and they need to be able to fill them up. So they may be less popular types of uses. Sometimes in the planner world, we might call those LULUs, locally unwanted land use.
LULUs. Yeah. So when you say locally unwanted land use, you're saying this is a thing, a type of building or business that
no one wants to live next to.
Yeah. Fair.
You want access to them, but you don't want it to be next to you. And those are really tough. And, even things like electrical substations or treatment plants. There's just all this stuff that is so necessary to the functioning of a city, but it's a really tough question of where you want to locate it, especially when there's that intersection with where people live.
That's a really good point. And I like the point you make that it's not just gas stations. There are other things that service or serve us and our everyday modern needs that we really need, but we don't want to look at or be a neighbor to.
Exactly. And that's where planning comes in as a practice in many ways. Its origins, some of the first ways that, the idea of planning existed, that uses should be separated out. That, for example, you don't want a slaughterhouse right next to a whole bunch of residences, or you don't want, a smelting or factory, something like that, there's health concerns, there's nuisance concerns. And that's honestly kind of the foundation of planning in many ways, is figuring out how you group together appropriate and compatible uses when you're thinking about planning a city.
Oh my God, I could talk to you about this all day, because now I'm thinking about all these different neighborhoods in Denver in particular that have examples of what you're talking about, both the positive and the negative, right? I'm thinking immediately of Globeville and the Purina factory versus, a couple miles up, you have Congress Park, and it doesn't have any of those sorts of issues. But, well, we're talking about gas stations today, and so this is a This thought that some folks on council have is putting a moratorium on where gas stations can be built. How would a ban on gas stations along this particular corridor, along Evans, affect that area?
On one hand, there are numerous existing gas stations along this corridor, and those honestly would probably benefit from a
less
ban
competition
because there's less competition. Exactly, and so I wouldn't be surprised if those owners are supportive of this. And there's the question of whether the number of gas stations there is adequate to serve the need in the area, and it probably is, at least according to the council members and the research that they've done. I believe Councilmember Cashman mentioned that he's never lacked for finding a place to fill up his car. That's not a shortage we have in Denver. We have shortages of things like housing, grocery stores, food access. We don't have a shortage of access to gas stations. So the ban or the proposal being discussed here would sort of freeze the number of gas stations that are currently there. However, if one were to close, that might open up opportunities for others. That's something that I think they're still discussing. But it really would impact how the corridor develops in the future. And that goes to what this proposal is trying to do in terms of land use, which is really think about how we want these corridors to change from being those automobile-centric places where you've got a bunch of what planners call curb cuts, essentially driveways. Again, stuff that makes it really difficult to walk around as a pedestrian. And so the ban or the proposal would allow, when redevelopment does happen, that it would be encouraged to be more things that are like housing or shops, just something that's not an automobile-oriented use.
Councilwoman Amanda Sawyer told Denver, I quote, "What our residents have said is we want to see housing, like you're talking about. We want to see small businesses. We want to see coffee shops where we can go hang out with our friends and we can walk down the street from our house." But the struggle that I'm having here is making that connection between how do we get from those concerns to banning gas stations? Like, how do those things connect? What's the connection?
Yeah. And it is complicated. It's all about opportunity. So what is so interesting about land use is that you've got these rules and regulations in the code, but property is owned by private individuals for the most part.
Sure.
And so you put out these rules into the wild, and then you see what decisions happen on an individual basis as properties turn over and development happens. We can't control exactly what will happen, but we can create these rules that create a framework for pushing development in the right direction. So again, this moratorium or this proposal, it's not going to guarantee that we get housing. It's not going to guarantee anything with, again, decisions made on a private property, but it can really help by at least preventing some of what they're probably considering worst case scenarios, which is business as usual. Again, more gas stations, more automobile access. When what we have in our plans is, and what the community members have come out and said, is that we want these areas, when they do redevelop, whenever that happens, again, it's up to the private property owner, that the sort of the menu of types of buildings that they can build is going to be more towards what we want.
Okay, so it's like by eliminating one option for that land use, maybe that would nudge towards some other uses that are more pedestrian-centric or pedestrian-friendly.
Exactly.
Because I'm thinking, well, again, I know this corridor so well. The sidewalks suck. The crosswalks suck. Like sometimes you have to walk, 5 or 6 blocks, 7 blocks to get to the next crosswalk that's semi-safe for you because there's a light at it. And then so you cross and then you walk back 7 blocks to the place you're trying to get to. So I can see the struggle where okay, so we say no gas stations, but that's not magically going to make sidewalks appear.
No, and nothing's going to happen overnight.
Right.
And it is hard with a corridor like Evans to imagine it being different. It's
so much parking, right?
There's so much parking, and we're talking about a pretty dramatic transformation of what these corridors are going to look like. I can actually think maybe an example is along Colorado Boulevard, where the old medical complex has been redeveloped.
At like Ninth.
Exactly. And you've got very tall apartment buildings. Those are built very close to the sidewalk. There's now trees and planters. And I'm not saying it's a great experience walking down Colorado Boulevard there. It's still a really heavily trafficked area. But that type of development at least is going more towards the direction of, oh, it's not just a bunch of, again, gas stations, setback buildings, strip mall type of things. It's got a little bit more of that pedestrian friendly feel.
I'm so glad you brought that section up, because I've had that very experience where I think I was at, is it like, it's like at Postino? There's a restaurant right there.
Yeah, Postino.
In that complex. And I remember walking along Colorado Boulevard with my friend to go there and laughing, because we both grew up here, going, can you believe we're walking down Colorado Boulevard?
Yeah.
But it's because it's the beginning of the transition to this more pedestrian-centric design, and it has to start somewhere. So even it's like one section of Colorado Boulevard, it's still what could be.
Yeah, it has to start somewhere. That's a really good way of phrasing it. And it's going to feel haphazard.
Yes.
And part of that is because, like, the sidewalk infrastructure, like you're talking about, there's standards for what the city is going to allow going forward when a property is redeveloped. And it is, sidewalks, wide sidewalks that are set back from the street, and tree lawns, and things like that. And that often happens as a result of new development. It's part of the requirement when a property gets redeveloped that they improve the sidewalk in front of that property. But that leads to this sort of haphazard situation that you're starting to see along these different corridors.
Like, you'll have that section where you're like, oh, this is walkable. And then you get to the next block and you're like, there's no sidewalk here.
Yeah.
Where do I go from here? And again, I think about these things. I live along Alameda. This is why you see folks in the street in the winter, because there's a minimal sidewalk or it hasn't been plowed. I can just see where the haphazardness makes a lot of sense. But the other thought I'm thinking is sort of the other roles that a gas station plays. So gas stations serve a lot of folks beyond just car drivers. I mean, they sell food and drinks. Sometimes they provide restrooms, maybe a place to fill your tire on your bicycle. So, like, as a planner, maybe putting yourself in the shoes of city council, how do you balance the needs of the community against individuals who use these services provided by gas stations?
I think that's a really good point, that gas stations are not just gas stations, they're often convenience stores. And unfortunately, in our city, for some communities, actually including the one that I live in a food desert, those are some of the only places I can go to get food.
Get milk, you can get eggs.
Correct.
Frozen meals.
Yeah. And that in itself is a problem. But it is something to consider when looking at, are new gas stations going to provide this? Again, the fact that this proposal doesn't remove existing gas stations, and that there are a fair number of them around the city, I don't think that that's as big of a concern, but it is something that I've heard brought up in this conversation, that they do provide more than just gas stations. There's also a really interesting question of, as our country is transitioning more to electric vehicle charging, and there may be incentives coming down from the federal government in order to locate those, gas stations would obviously be a natural place for EV charging stations to go. And that may also help with access for people that need to charge electric vehicles but maybe don't have the infrastructure to set that up in their own home. And these are all considerations that the decision makers are really going to have to look at with this legislation.
The EV component of it is really interesting because, like you said, most homes don't have the electrical capacity to charge. You can't just plug it into the plug in your garage, right? And so you're saying, like, these also can serve as places for folks to charge their cars. How are we going to balance that with the idea that maybe we don't want gas stations anymore? It's just, it's much more complicated. But
it's incredibly complicated, yeah.
I love the land use thought about this too, because it's like you said, you live in a food desert, but like city council can't force a grocery store to open in a neighborhood, right? You can't make a business appear that you want there. So this is just maybe one approach to removing options for landowners for something that we want less of, with the idea that maybe something else could go in there.
Exactly. Especially because once a property is redeveloped, a new gas station goes in or a new building of any sort, you've removed that piece of property from, the chessboard for 20, 30 years. And that's, again, it kind of goes back to that lost opportunity framework, which I think is what we're working with here.
That's a good point too, is like, we complain a lot about new development in the city, but I think one of the things that's really beautiful about it is if we can help determine something going into an old space that has a better use for the future. And it's a lot about thinking about the future. Councilwoman Amanda Sawyer said that most residents she's heard from would like to ban gas stations altogether. Do you think that's a possibility? Like, would we do that?
I think that's pretty unlikely in Denver.
Yeah.
Again, they are, as wherever you fall on pro individual vehicle or not, it's a reality of our lives at this point and for the foreseeable future that a lot of people, if not the majority, do depend on their personal vehicles. And so removing all gas stations would be pretty dramatic. I also, from a legal standpoint, that would be quite the move because, again, you would be actually telling property owners that they could not exist anymore. So I don't think that would happen.
Are there other ways to approach this issue? Because gas stations can't be the only car-centric business that doesn't promote walkability. Like, why do you think the approach wasn't to ban or put a moratorium on car washes, tire shops, drive-throughs? Like, why do you think... What would be the thought process behind starting just with gas stations?
Well, first of all, I'd say I wouldn't be surprised if that comes next.
Really?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's because all of these uses fall into a type of building, a type of property that gets developed that's just car-centric. And in the zoning code, it's usually referred to as automobile services, light or heavy. They, again, going back to the first question that we discussed, they're oriented towards cars. They're not oriented towards people. And there's a whole class of them. So in some ways, why are we focusing on gas stations right now? I think that there's, as the council members have brought up, there's particular environmental and health concerns with gas stations that are absolutely unique, that are not necessarily present with a drive-through restaurant, for example.
They don't have a tanker underneath them full of
that's
gas.
going to leak inevitably and require...
And become a super fun site.
Exactly. But, and people like drive-through restaurants, drive-through coffee shops, things like that, more so than maybe a gas station. So I would say the gas station is an easy place to start. It's a popular... so far, it seems like they've got quite a bit of support. And the idea for this, I believe, has come from residents in these districts that brought it up to their council members. And why are we getting gas stations? But addressing more the form of what these buildings and these services look like would require a pretty substantial change in the zoning code. And the planning department will want to do a very vigorous community outreach process for that, a very rigorous look into what are the unintended consequences of doing that. And it's really a big lift because when you change something like that in the zoning code, you really want to get it right. Because if you don't, you end up creating all sorts of problems and unpredictability. And it's just a disaster.
So when we talk about climate, walkability, and housing, is there anything in the planning world that planners are excited about right now? Is there something on the horizon, or I don't know, it's just something we're constantly talking about, but you all are sort of at the forefront of helping create what our cities look like in the future?
I think what is really exciting in one way is the fact that planning is kind of having a moment in the national consciousness. It's a very interesting time to be a planner. I share with probably a lot of my colleagues when we went to school, if we did go to, for example, a master's degree program or something like this, a lot of us share the same background that we didn't know planning was a field that we could go into.
Totally.
Until, later years out of college and realized like, oh, this is actually a fascinating topic. This is what I want to do with my life. But because, unfortunately, of the housing crisis, but also, I mean, fortunately, in the sense that people are paying attention now to land use, and it impacts every aspect of our lives. Everybody experiences the impacts of planning. So I am very excited about that on one hand, because it's conversations that absolutely need to happen. In terms of a particular thing that's happening in planning and land use, the investment in Colorado, particularly in Denver, in bus rapid transit, is probably one of the most significant and transformative things that's going to happen for this city. And that also directly impacts what we're talking about today with the gas stations, because the corridors that bus rapid transit is looking at, again, is transforming those existing highways,
Right.
auto-oriented places into a completely different vision. And we want to make sure that the properties on either side of the street with these massive millions of dollars of investment in transit infrastructure are going to support that infrastructure, because you need people to live along these corridors and to work along these corridors, and that gas stations are just not compatible with the vision the community has here.
I'm glad you brought up BRT, because it's like, if you're tired of gas stations, this is a great thing to support that's happening in the city, because it's creating a dedicated bus lane that creates more space for the bus and less space for cars, but also makes it easier for folks to get on and off. I mean, it is serving exactly like you're saying, these transitions we want to make to a less car-centric city. And it's just something good to think about as we move along with that project. Is it's not just BRT that's going to change how our city looks. It's all these other, the land use, what goes in, I think about, even like, we romanticize the old streetcar in Denver, but if you think about neighborhoods, that if you live in a neighborhood in the city, there might be a section of your neighborhood that has a strip of businesses on it. We know them as commercial nodes in the planning world, but like those were developed there because people were getting on and off of the streetcar. And so we could see a similar thing happen with BRT.
Exactly. I'm so glad you brought that up, because this isn't new.
Totally.
This isn't new at all. In fact, the former transit network, those streetcars, were how a lot of most of our beloved original bungalow neighborhoods were built. There was a transit line that was installed, and then there was development that happened around it because people could access those areas. And specifically our, shopfront clusters, I think of Tennyson.
Tennyson is a perfect
Exactly.
example. That was created because of that service. It was serving the folks in the neighborhood, especially along the streetcar.
Yeah. And it was meant for you to get off your transit stop and walk. And you can see that in the way the buildings, the pace, we talked about pace in the beginning, the pace is a pedestrian pace of those buildings. You walk, and every 25 feet, there's a new storefront. It's got big windows, you can look in. You were meant to get off the transit stop, walk around, do your shopping, get back on transit, and go
head home.
And that is what we're trying to do again in the city with bus rapid transit, with these enhanced transit corridors.
I love that thought. Well, that's something good to think about as we move forward and watch this, whatever happens with this proposal. Naomi, thank you so much. This was really fun.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
That's all for today here on CityCast Denver. If you enjoyed the show, why not take a minute to tell the guy at 7-Eleven about us? Rate the show wherever you get your podcasts, and subscribe to our morning newsletter and learn more about us at denver.citycast.fm. We'll be back tomorrow morning with more news from around the city. See ya!